Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. Supporting student teachers in planning and evaluation.
Hello and welcome back to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching. We have an episode for you today that follows a similar format to one that we put in our previous season that looks at mentoring practice, and it's sort of presenting and framing some of the resources that we've made, video and audio resources that help mentors support student teachers with various different aspects of their practice. I think the last one we made was about supporting student teachers when observing teaching going on in the classroom. And this episode, we're going to be looking at mentoring practice to support student teachers' planning and evaluation of lessons.
Yeah, those mentors spend so much time with the student teachers, and we really need to make sure that we give them lots of love in the form of resources to make them, get them thinking about the way that they work with those student teachers. But we can't just go drop in a massive tome on their desks. So we've settled on this format of audio and video. They've told us very clearly they like them to be short. And also they really like it when we get school colleagues in to do it as well. So the voices that you're going to hear today, along with us, are Anne Hodgson, our colleague, friend of the podcast, who's kind of facilitating the discussions. And then we've got James Wise, another friend of the podcast, and Kate Haynes. They're both school colleagues. And so we got them into this very studio talking about planning and evaluation, how we can get them to support student teachers.
We did, and it's worth mentioning, just a bit of context, that these materials were made together with school colleagues and student teachers. We had student teachers on our PGC primary and secondary programmes present when we were co-constructing these resources. So we've sort of made them with the sort of challenges and opportunities that they brought to the table in mind. So let's hear the first clip now, where you're going to hear Anne, Kate and James talking about the sort of big picture, the why. Why do we need student teachers and their mentors working together to develop planning and evaluating of lessons?
Okay, right. So we're going to start with the question, why are plan and evaluation so important to student teachers and the learning of student teachers?
Well, teaching is such a complicated thing, isn't it? As experienced teachers, there's so much goes into our plan of our lessons and our schemes of learning. And student teachers arrive into the classroom without any of that real experience behind them. So when they're trying to plan for learning, what they tend to do, I find, is they tend to think about their own performance. They look at what teachers do and they try to sort of sometimes mimic that a little bit, and what am I going to be doing as a teacher in the classroom? So fundamentally, they focus on the pedagogy side of it, which is a huge part of planning, and they plan for their pedagogy. But I think what they perhaps don't do is think about two other fundamentals of lesson planning, which is the purpose, i.e. the learning intentions, and then the assessment, are pupils learning those things? The student teachers tend to rush to that pedagogy without a real grasp of what the learning intentions actually are. If they grasp what those learning intentions are, really specifically, the pedagogy then becomes a little bit clearer and more straightforward, and fundamentally the assessment of that learning becomes far clearer. If we're clear on what it is we want the pupils to learn, it's far easier to assess whether the pupils have learned those things. But like I say, student teachers arrive with very little experience. They tend to imitate what they see a little bit and focus a little bit more on the pedagogy. If they could bring in those other two aspects, the purpose, the learning intentions and the assessment, then I think their lessons and the learning for the pupils would be far more effective, really. So I think, grasping those fundamentals are really, really important.
Yeah, and I think, it's understandable, isn't it, that they're observing a lot, and what they see, they think that's what I've got to do. But they don't necessarily link or connect with the fact that there's been a whole set of planning that's gone into this, a huge part of evaluation that's gone into this lesson happening.
The thought process.
The thought process behind it. They're just
doing.
seeing the magic happening. I mean, and then it's sort of, well, I've got to do that. So I think it has to be absolutely, made clear to them and become a visible part of that process, guiding them through those parts. This is what I did here. This is that part of the planning. Did you notice this? This is the evaluation part. Exactly.
Yeah, fantastic. And actually that brings us on to the next point, which is that element of evaluation. Why is evaluation as a process such, an intrinsic part of the planning cycle.
Yeah, you can't have planning without evaluation. They're inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. I mean, if you're going into plan a lesson, you have to know how that lesson has landed, how the learners have grasped it, how's everybody got it, where are we all at? You might have to take it a few steps back, you might need to take it a few steps forward, but you absolutely cannot plan without evaluating and knowing it's those outcomes, isn't it, as well? It's looking at and thinking about the assessment of those learners.
Yeah,
because I think what the student teachers tend to a little bit, certainly when they started off in their evaluation, is they tend to evaluate their own performance in the classroom. What did I do as a teacher? Yeah. But it's making them sort of see the shift from evaluating their own performance to evaluating the learning. What did the pupils actually grasp in this lesson? And if they can think along those lines, I think the evaluations become more efficient, essentially, and which feeds into the plan of the next series of lessons.
Yeah, as you say, it's that cycle, isn't it? So, the evaluating, planning, teaching, evaluating, and it feeds forward. Fantastic. So how do we ensure that student teachers understand how to plan and evaluate? Because it is a complex process that for many of our mentors is second nature now. So how do we ensure that student teachers develop those skills?
I think probably the best tool mentors have to help student teachers with this is the planning template on the PLP, really. So that's got the fundamentals of planning incorporated in it. So you've got your learning intentions, your purpose, and really explicitly focusing on those a little bit. You've got sections then for the pedagogy, how we're going to enable that learning to happen. And then there's the section thinking about assessment, how do we know if pupils have learned it? But also part of that built in then is the evaluation, where student teachers can evaluate what's happened in the room. Yes, their own performance as a teacher, but importantly, the evaluation of the learning that's actually occurred in that room.
Okay, so how does the mentor feature in this? How do our mentors support the planning and evaluation processes for student teachers?
I suppose it can be quite tricky for a mentor because the planning template on the PLP is probably very different or slightly different to what they're used to in their own institutions, and every school sort of plans in slightly different ways. But the way the mentor can support really is to think about fundamentally all lesson plans revolve around essentially those three fundamentals: the learning intentions, plan for the pedagogy, and plan for the assessment. So as long as the mentor is focusing on those three aspects and talking through those three aspects with the student teacher, that's a real way of supporting their planning and therefore their evaluation. Yeah,
I think as well it's going back to that thing about making sure that your thought processes as a mentor, whilst you're teaching, that they're made clear that there's links back to, why you've done those things, why you've planned for those things, and you can make that explicit both, whilst planning alongside your student, or during the actual teaching. There's moments where you can pull that back to, this is why I planned for this. This is why this works at this point in this lesson. Just to be really, really clear about that.
Yeah, it's that learning to drive analogy, isn't it?
It is. It's exactly that.
Yeah, it's all those little processes that we now do on autopilot without thinking them through.
Exactly.
Yet. They have to verbalise those and explain them to the student teachers.
Because we may not, as experienced teachers, you may not, plan in the detail that you have to as a student teacher. But that means that you need to be even more clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah, and using that planning template, the log on the PLP as a record over time, how useful is that?
I think that's really important because what you've got there is sort of is progression essentially, haven't you? Or hopefully you've got progression. So you've got a series of lesson plans and how student teachers' plan is developing and evolving over time. And as a mentor, you can sort of look at those as the whole really and sort of diagnose where sort of issues may be, gaps in knowledge or understanding, and then think about what can I do then as a mentor to support those things if I'm seeing things coming up again and again. What steps can I put in to support the student teachers to make progress? So as a series, they offer a sort of a diagnostic tool, I suppose.
It's interesting because we've spoken so much in so many episodes about the way that experienced teachers kind of make things a bit invisible because they're so used to it. And it's just lovely hearing experienced teachers there talking about what is really the central part of teaching, which is that whole kind of planning and evaluating thing, which is the absolute thing that nobody sees, which is actually probably in the head of the teacher who's experienced a lot of the time. but has to be unpacked and sort of laid out step by step and gone through step by step in a process that is not always the most popular, let's be honest, with the new student teacher, because they see their mentors not doing it. It's just lovely hearing them talk about it.
It really is. And you can't get away from the fact that particularly when you're new to it, it's labour intensive, it's time consuming. There are some traps along the way in that you may feel that you need to write certain things to tick certain boxes or to demonstrate that you know about something. But really what it is, and James sort of hit the nail on the head in his last few comments there, it sort of becomes a bit of an artifact over time that actually I've heard some of my previous student teachers say to me, I look back at some of my early lesson plans and I thought, oh my gosh. And they think that because they can see how far they've come. And so the lesson plan and evaluation, is proof, I suppose, of their own progression, how they're developing their understanding of all of the different concepts, practices, pedagogical content knowledge they're developing over time that is evident in the lesson plan and evaluation.
Yeah, and I think James is hinting at something quite interesting there, which has been a bit of a back and forth that we've had as a team and as a partnership, which is this whole thing that we have a lesson planning template which is designed for student teachers to plan. And of course, schools will often have a lesson planning template that's specific to that school. Sometimes it's kind of quite well used and sometimes it's hidden away a little bit. But there will sometimes be this question of, well, why don't we use the school's planning template? And of course, if you're dealing with a bunch of experienced teachers in a school, sometimes that planning template will be doing a different job, or it certainly might be a bit lighter touch, or it might be kind of looking for certain consistency sort of things that they're looking for in the school, whereas we're having to kind of mercilessly unpack absolutely everything and get the student teachers to think about stuff in a slightly different way. And I think James kind of explains that really well there.
Yeah, I think he does. And to bring it sort of bang up to date, Tom and I have been working with our student teachers recently looking at various different applications of AI in teaching and learning. And, it could be quite tempting as a student teacher, given that it's labour intensive, given that it's time consuming, to use AI tools to assist you with your lesson planning. But I think what we've got to remember is what it comes back to in terms of the student teacher's learning is what it doesn't do is it doesn't know the kids that you're working with. It doesn't know where they are in their learning. It doesn't know their needs. It doesn't necessarily know the subject or the context or, all of that really important information that is distinctive to a time and a place. It doesn't know that and it can't do it. So we sort of came to a conclusion with our student teachers that, using those sorts of tools early on when you haven't really grasped and begun to master all of the sort of fundamental concepts, practices of what it means to teach and to facilitate quality learning, then it's not necessarily going to be your friend, and that it's going to perhaps reinforce some of those performative aspects of teaching that pedagogy before purpose that James was alluding to right at the start.
Yeah, and it's quite a neat segue, I suppose, into the idea that rather than using an artificial intelligence to kind of string together a bunch of activities, as a student teacher, you have got a real intelligence available to you, which is your mentor who's there in the department. And one of the things we discussed with this group, and which we've discussed a bit more widely, is this idea that we sort of feel that the idea of planning and teaching together as a pair has perhaps not had the love that it deserves here, and that perhaps we've sort of put it in there as a thing that people can do, but we've never really dug into the details of the many, many different ways that you can do that process where, you're working with an experienced teacher and then kind of laying things out in the moment and all of that. So we asked the group to have a little chat about the various kind of potentials that working together in planning and teaching, and I guess evaluating as well, as a pair, as a little team, what the potential is there for learning. So let's have a listen to what they've got to say about that.
Okay, so we're just going to move on to talking about team planning and teaching. which was originally called team teaching in the clinical practice cycles, but we rebranded it to highlight the importance of the planning part of the team planning and teaching process. So just want to start off with a discussion about what is the importance of the team planning part of that team planning and teaching process.
I think it makes a real sort of difference to the student teachers in terms of their planning, because when they plan in isolation as a student teacher, or mentor plans in isolation and communicates that plan to the student, a lot can sort of get lost a little bit, and the student teachers perhaps don't see actually what's going into the plan. In planning with an expert, in planning together, I think it really helps the student teachers see the planning process, the thoughts behind that, how the learning intentions link to the pedagogy and how that links to the assessment, and it all sort of brings it together, brings it to life, and gives them a bit of clarity for planning. On top of that, then, when they come to the team teaching aspect of it, rather than be sort of a passenger who gets sort of thrown in to a lesson, this is your little bit of the lesson, and then they do their bit and then off they go again, they're really part of the whole learning that's going on in the room. They can see how their aspect of pedagogy really fits into the learning intentions and how their aspect of pedagogy might fit into some sort of assessment criteria. So that it helps in that regard as well. And then on top of that, then, when they finish their little bits, they're not these sort of passive people who just go back and sit in the corner and make notes. They're still part of the room because they understand the whole learning that's happening for that lesson. They can still be contributing to that as well. So I think that move from team teaching to team planning and teaching is really, really helpful in many ways, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think then it's about extending that process, isn't it? So as you say, if they can jointly evaluate, that would then, at the end of the lesson, that would then also feed back into that planning cycle of they've planned it together, they've delivered it together, they've evaluated it together, and now we're feeding forward into how would that inform subsequent lessons, subsequent learning. In terms of where schools have existing planning in place, because this is something that we come across frequently with student teachers where they're in school placements and the planning documents look very different, and often schools have existing planning that they're working from. How can we support student teachers with that side of the process?
I would say it's getting them to feel confident and comfortable with the language of lesson planning. So to one person, a learning intention might be in another school a learning objective or a WALT or whatever you want to call it. This can be really confusing if you don't know, you haven't been around, you haven't seen that language before. And so really taking the time to look at that planner, look at the Cardiff Met planner, look at the planning that you do as a school, and take time to match up those parts and say, this is the same as that, except we just call it something different. So there's a huge part of that where we just need to translate it, right, to make it accessible. And then the big part, I think, is, and this is perhaps the hard part, but the most crucial part, is the know your learners bit. It's the tailoring it to the learners. So you can't just have a plan and just go and deliver that, because the class isn't necessary. You haven't catered for that class's needs necessarily. So being the keeper of all that information as the mentor, right? You are that person. You are the person with all the data. You know those children, and you need to give that. You need to give that to those student teachers, because they won't have that automatically. They need to be looking at parts of that lesson and saying, well, how will this work for child A, who we've talked about, right? We've talked about this group of learners over here. How's that going to work for them? Do we perhaps think that maybe we need to try something different? Do they need something different in that diet to enable them to achieve what we want them to achieve in that lesson? So I think that the whole thing of that can be really confusing. I think if you're new into a class and you're new into this and you're trying to decode the planning, the tailoring of it, and that's the gift that you can give as a mentor.
Yeah, absolutely. And modelling that, as you say, really supports the student teachers as they move forward through the placement to have the confidence to know how to go from the school's planning into their own kind of tailored planning. Because at the same time, we've got that expectation for student teachers to be innovative.
Absolutely.
And to design really innovative learning opportunities and activities. And so giving them the confidence to know how we go from this existing plan to what I deliver on the ground is an important part of the process. In terms of then, we know the team planning and teaching is a built-in, scheduled part of the clinical practice placement. But it isn't just a once and done process, is it? As we've said earlier, the teaching and evaluating and planning process is ongoing all the way through. So in what sorts of ways could we revisit this as a tool with our student teachers to further enhance their learning?
Well, one thing we sort of have discussed a little bit is the idea of the mentor actually teaching lessons planned by the student teacher themselves. So a benefit of this, I suppose, is if the mentor and the student teacher have planned the lesson, or predominantly the student teacher has planned the lesson, and the mentor's happy that the lesson is sort of sound and there's a good plan in place, the execution of that lesson then could go in multiple different ways. As we know, things happen in the classroom, there's so many variables, and as teachers we have to adapt and we respond to what happens in front of us. And sometimes I think student teachers struggle to make those things just through lack of experience. They struggle to adapt or struggle to respond to what goes on. So the plan could be sound, the lesson could still fall down because the student teacher hasn't sort of adapted to the needs of the room at that time. So if the mentor could actually be teaching the student teacher's lesson that's been planned and can then model how to adapt, how to respond in the room, I think it bridges that gap there, or can help bridge that gap for student teachers so they can see, that's what I could have done, or in the future that's what I could do. And not rigidly stick to the plan, which student teachers sort of tend to as a bit of a crutch, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think as they become more confident, what you want to see is that adaptive teaching coming out, responding to the learners in front of you. We talked about tailoring the plan. We do that for that reason, but things can still change.
Yeah.
You never know what day you're going to get when you step into a classroom. And with, as you say, so many variables, you have to be, again, know your learners. So as you go along that, as the student teachers get better at knowing their learners, they'll hopefully get better, more adept at, changing the direction if they need to, changing a resource, doing something differently. And as you said, I think that comes from the mentor modelling that and saying, that's okay. That's absolutely okay to do that. It's what we're trying to get the learners to do that's important.
Yeah. And it's those conversations, isn't it, with the mentors to reflect on, as you say, if they've delivered a student teacher's plan and they've made adaptations, the student teacher can see it in the moment as they're following their original lesson plan. And then those conversations afterwards about, why do you think I did that in the moment? Why did that come about? What can we take from that in terms of planning moving forward? A potential, really, really useful tool for the student teachers.
Something I really geek out on when I listen back to these clips is how specialised and how, if considered in a really purposeful way, mentoring practice, teacher education, pedagogy, whatever we'd like to call it, how specialised it is, and how actually just with a bit more thought about, why am I doing this with this student in this way, and to what extent is it going to help the student teacher's learning, which seems really obvious, I know, but just taking the time to really reflect on your teacher education practice is really important, and something that I've really valued from having the experience of working with teachers to create these sorts of resources. Yeah,
I was thinking the same. I mean, I was sort of musing on the fact there's probably going to be people listening to this from maybe quite far afield, or maybe who don't do initial teacher education at all. Maybe they're teaching away in a school somewhere. And I know that, every now and again we hear a kind of Cardiff Met specific piece of terminology. But as you say, the kind of principles are being talked about there. I was sort of thinking, if you're listening to this and you are a teacher and that kind of grabs you because you like this whole thing about re-unpacking what it is that you do as a teacher and what you've stopped thinking about, maybe this is something, to go into, go and find an opportunity to go and kind of work with student teachers. Because I know when I was teaching, it was my absolute favourite thing, doing that stuff. I'll tell you what else was interesting as well. They talked about planning again, and they talked about this whole thing about, well, what if the school has got plans?
Yes.
And it made me think, I mean, if people are listening from England particularly to this episode, I mean, I did a little trip to our friends down at Oxford University a little while ago, and I watched I watched the lecture on planning that they got, which was given by a really quite famous IT person, Catherine Byrne. And the really interesting thing she was talking about, which we don't know anything about here in Wales, I suppose, was this idea of academy chains where plans are sort of, they descend from a kind of management team who might be covering several schools, and teachers deliver this stuff. And there's a really nice kind of workload sort of angle to that, I suppose. But Oxford and I guess English ITE partnerships have to actually say to a lot of these schools, a lot of these chains of schools, please, you've got to give our students the opportunity to plan some stuff for themselves occasionally. And that's kind of really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And it's actually something that was mentioned by our two student teachers in the group that worked on these resources. And there were two things that came to light. So number one, not one of the two things, but generally this is happening in Wales as well. And the two issues that they identified with that is, number one, this idea of not knowing the underpinning rationale reason behind why, that content was chosen, why that task is sequenced before that one, and also this sort of fear around it of, am I allowed to change this order because I've got different learners in front of me? There's that. And then the other thing that they mentioned, which is quite challenging, is that sometimes there can be mixed messages. So they will have, as Anne mentioned in the clip, mentors who are like, we want you to bring your own slant on this. We want you to sort of bring fresh ideas. And when you've got something that feels so rigid, actually that can be quite challenging, and you might need some, again, when you come back to sort of team plan, you might need a bit of support even when you're quite far along in your teacher education journey and progress, to know, which bits and to what extent, does that mean that you can go, right, okay, well, sorry, I don't want to use this at all. I would actually rather do this here with these kids.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, it's been going on forever, hasn't it? I mean, yeah, it's academy chains we sort of don't have anything about. But you're right. But here in Wales, but you're right. The idea of sort of centralised stuff has been around. I mean, certainly it was around when I was teaching, and certainly in bigger departments in secondary, I suppose, isn't it? It's like English departments, maths departments. You've got like 10 teachers in there, maybe, and nobody's saying that's a bad thing. I mean, I must admit, I'm terrible at teaching other people's stuff, as I think I've mentioned before. But it's not a bad thing, on a workload kind of angle. And if somebody is the expert on something, absolutely get them to make some goodies. But I suppose if you are going to be hosting a student teacher, you've got to have a little bit of a think about where you might be able to crowbar in a little bit of space there, particularly later on. And then maybe as a student teacher, you perhaps need to think that maybe you do need to do this stuff as it is initially, because of course those guys on the clips are saying how important it is to get to know the place before you start tearing apart what's there.
Yeah, that's right. It was interesting actually hearing Kate, who's a primary practitioner, talking about how through team planning the mentor says, okay, what do we know about this child that's going to affect the way we do this one? Is this plan going to work in the same way? And something is quite distinctive to secondary that I often hear new student teachers arriving on the programme in September say is, if I'm teaching this same lesson to 3 different Year 7 classes, can I not just use copy and paste?
Yeah.
It's a really
good question.
Innocent,
perfectly sensible
question. It is, but that this is, again, you come back to teacher educator pedagogy. That is a novice perspective. There are misconceptions. There are challenges that they're going to have to be explicit early on about why that's not appropriate. But then if you can hand them over to mentors who are then team planning with them and going, right, this is the plan for this Year 7 class. However, here are some things that you need to know. And then it lands, even more authentically because, they're in that context. They're working with a mentor who's reiterating those messages.
Yeah, so team planning and teaching, if you haven't sort of really dug into that, if you're still, as James puts it, just kind of saying, well, I'll do this, I'll do the starter and you do the middle bit and I'll do the end kind of thing, divvying it up just by activities, that's one to have a really good dig into. We finished off with a chat about what is a really impactful part of the student-teacher experience, which is that quality time they get with the mentor, the meetings that they get. And obviously, brief shout out here to the mentors, as we often say. I mean, certainly where we are, they don't get, in many places, any extra time to do these meetings. I mean, some schools are really kind of enlightened and do manage to do that for the mentors, but generally speaking, they're finding time in the gaps for these meetings. They're really, really important. And so we thought it was worth having a little bit of a dig into some of the things that can happen in those meetings in relation to this topic.
Okay, so we're moving on now to mentor meetings and how we can use mentor meetings to focus on planning and evaluating our lessons. Now, we all know that mentors have, incredibly limited time. They're very busy people. So how can we use that time really effectively and efficiently in those weekly mentor meetings to focus on the planning and evaluating?
Yeah, if you think about sort of the plan, teach, evaluate sort of cycle, depends where you are in that time the student teacher's been with you. But focusing on the evaluation is probably a good place to start with the mentor meetings, and looking back, looking through the blue book, looking through, they may have taught 6, 7, 8, 9 lessons, and looking for all of the common themes, where are the areas of strength, but perhaps more importantly, where are the areas of development that they're being highlighted. And maybe focusing on 2 or 3 of those key areas to then think about as they look forward to their planning for the week ahead, incorporating those in the plans in some way.
Yeah, I think then it really is linking all of that feedback, isn't it? As you were saying, all along the way with the blue book, everything that you're giving them back into the planning, getting that planning up, getting it up on the PLP, asking them a question, did you plan for that? How did you plan for that? I see that this is a recurring theme here. We've talked about questioning quite a bit. We've talked about how did you plan for that? And it might be that they haven't. It might be that they say, well, I didn't. And maybe they didn't realise they had to. So there's your way in, isn't it? There's your way into improving that.
Yeah, supporting them to understand how to use that planning format and process
exactly
to develop their practice.
Yes.
So if they've just put questions in their assessment strategies, and you've identified as the mentor that their questioning is poor and needs developing, that's that conversation point there to say, moving forward, you could actually
and be really specific, with that as well, I think.
So the plan then, what are you looking for then in the plan moving forward? So for next week, we're going to plan different types of questioning. So for example, we might try some no hands up questioning, some cold call questioning as part of that. So specific targets then as part of the plan moving forward.
Fab. And I think we quite often in those mentor meetings, we can often focus on the teaching part, can't we? We can often focus our feedback on the what went well or what could be better in terms of the delivery, but making sure that we bring those conversations back to what goes in at the planning stage and what goes in at the evaluation stage. The other thing I think is quite interesting is when we're identifying ways in which the student teacher could improve their practice, their delivery, their planning. Had they identified that themselves on their lesson plans? Have they written about that in their evaluations? Did they realise that was an area for development? So it's using all of those tools to further develop the practice. And there are also existing support materials for mentors out there beyond this conversation. In the CP guide, we've got the effective mentoring conversations and how to have them crib sheet. It's a really useful resource for mentors to frame some of those conversations.
Okay, and again, I just keep coming back to this idea that, what are the sort of evidence bases that we're drawing upon to help us support student teachers. It doesn't all have to come from what we see them do in the classroom. These conversations can be very enlightening, but also the lesson plan itself, as a source of evidence and as a formative assessment tool, can be quite powerful. And I think Anne's given a really good example there with regard to questioning about how, oftentimes what we see falling down in the classroom can be traced back to something that wasn't thought about or planned thoroughly enough at the planning stage.
Oh, yeah. The more I visited schools, in this new job, the more I realised that stuff that looked like something else was usually planning when you dug all the way down. I think that discussion also really kind of points up the fact that when a mentor is really sort of firing on all cylinders, they're this sort of central point for the student that's kind of pulling in so much stuff from so many different places, so much knowledge. They're going all the way down to almost like performance notes on individual lessons, and then sort of going up to a sort of diagnostic, holistic kind of view of their classroom practice. But then they're also sort of masters of knowledge of the pupils and data and who's good at this and who should you go and speak to about that. I mean, they are just such an important figure in the student teacher's life, really, when they're on placement.
Yeah, absolutely. And, yet they continue to be underfunded and have a lack of time. So
we love them, though.
We
love them.
really do. And for that reason, we've got a couple of, we've got a goodie to share, really. So I think something to try has been in abundance in this episode.
Yes.
So
something to try.
We'll ditch that short slot. However, if you're interested in having a look at some of the other materials that we've got, you can watch actually the videos that you just heard in audio form if you want to, again, on this site. But it's all sort of open and publicly available. We've got a couple of mentor handbook chapters, I say in air quotation marks, on this website. So if you go to youtube.com/@CP Mentors. That's our Cardiff Partnership for IT Mentor Resources site. And there's a hell of a lot of stuff on there that, has been designed to be easily consumed, quite quick to consume, very close to practice, that you could return to and use at your leisure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can hear from the clips that every now and again you hear something that's a little bit specific to this place, talking of CP guides and PLPs and stuff like that. But actually, when we're talking about planning, teaching and evaluating, we really are speaking a pretty universal language. And we are very happy if anybody out there is looking at this stuff and finding it useful. As Emma said, we've really tried not to produce weighty tomes. So there's video, there is audio, there are little write-ups. We'll stick some links in the show notes. But yeah, if you want to go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@CP Mentors.
So there you have it, a deep dive into supporting lesson planning and evaluation. Thanks for sticking with us, and we'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks' time.
You've been listening to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. Thanks to our lovely guests from the Mentor Handbook, Dr. Anne Hodgson from here at Cardiff Met, Kate Haynes from Danes Court Primary School, and James Wise from Cardiff High School. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blanford and the music is by Cameron Stewart. Technical support from Peter Lamburn, and the studio manager is Adrian Rapps. We'll be back in a fortnight with something else interesting. Until then, take care and enjoy teaching.